My husband gave me an ultimatum. He thought I could never survive. He smiled as he waited for my answer. He had no idea I had already made my choice. There is a particular kind of silence that only married people understand. It is not the silence of a peaceful house on a Sunday morning. It is not the silence of two people comfortable enough with each other that words are no longer necessary. No, this is a different silence entirely. This is the silence that fills a room after a man looks at his wife of 22 years. A woman who cooked his meals, raised his children, buried her own ambitions so his could breathe, who stayed when leaving would have been easier, who forgave when forgetting was impossible, and says to her with a calm that is somehow more frightening than any raised voice could ever be, "You need to choose, my family, or your dignity, because you cannot have both in this house." That sentence was spoken on a Sunday afternoon in a quiet neighborhood outside of Columbus, Ohio. The man who said it was named David. The woman who heard it was named Claire. And in the moment that followed, in the 3 seconds of silence that David would later describe as the most unsettling pause of his life, something shifted inside Claire that no ultimatum, no family gathering, no amount of pressure from his mother, Margaret, had ever been able to shift before. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not beg. She simply looked at him and said very quietly, "I'll let you know what I decide." David thought that was a win. He had no idea it was the beginning of his own undoing. Tonight, we are going to walk you through the full story of Claire and David. Every decision, every warning sign that was visible in hindsight and invisible in the moment. Every calculated move Claire made in the 3 years before that Sunday afternoon that David, and everyone around him, never even noticed she was making. We are going to tell you who these people were before this marriage, who they became inside it, and what one woman's quiet, methodical, two-envelope response to a 22-year ultimatum looked like in practice. Before we get deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if this is your first time on this channel, please hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what we cover here are interesting stories, decisions, and real consequences. Believe me, you will enjoy your time here. Now, there are 3 questions at the center of this story. The first is this: how does a man spend 22 years married to a woman and never truly see her? The second: what does it look like when a woman who has been quietly disappearing inside a marriage finally decides to reappear? And the third question: was David in control of his marriage, or he is simply a mummy's boy? Comment what you think the answer is below. To understand what happened in that kitchen on that Sunday afternoon in Columbus, Ohio, you have to go back. You have to go back further than the ultimatum, further than the 22 years of marriage, further even than the wedding itself. You have to go back to Indiana in the late 1980s, to a small farming town called Harlan, where a girl named Claire Patricia Hendricks grew up in a house where the word ambition was spoken almost like an apology. Where the women in her family worked hard and loved harder and quietly, consistently put their own needs at the bottom of a very long list. Claire watched her mother do it. She watched her aunts do it. And she swore, somewhere around the age of 16, standing in the kitchen of her family's home watching her mother iron her father's shirts at 11 o'clock at night after a full day of her own work, that she was going to do things differently. She was, by every account of people who knew her, genuinely exceptional. Her high school principal in Harlan told family friends that Claire was one of the sharpest students he had seen in 15 years of education. She was on the debate team. She volunteered at the county hospital on weekends. She read business textbooks the way other teenagers read magazines, not because anyone told her to, but because she was hungry for a life bigger than the one she had been handed as a template. She got a full scholarship to Indiana University, became the first woman in her immediate family to attend a 4-year university, and by her junior year was 2 semesters into a business degree with a plan to complete her MBA before she turned 26. She had a timeline. She had a vision. She had a blueprint for her own life drawn up with the kind of careful, serious attention that some people never manage even once. And then she met David Calloway at a friend's birthday party in Bloomington, Indiana, in the spring of her junior year, and the blueprint began to change. David Calloway was 24 years old, already a year into his first post-college job at a regional manufacturing firm, confident in the way of men who have never had reason to doubt themselves, handsome in the uncomplicated way that makes things feel easy at first. He drove a truck that was slightly too clean for someone who claimed not to care about appearances. He told Claire, on their second date, that she was the most interesting person he had ever met. And Claire, who had spent most of her life being interesting in rooms where interesting was not particularly valued, found that intoxicating. She had spent years being the smartest person and the loneliest person at the same time. David made her feel seen. That is a powerful thing to offer someone who has been invisible. What Claire could not have known, what nobody could have told her in a way she would have believed at 21, was that David's family was not a background detail of his life. It was the main character. His mother, Margaret Ann Calloway, was 62 years old at the time of the events we are discussing tonight, and she had been, by every meaningful measure, the invisible author of David's life for as long as anyone could remember. Margaret was the kind of woman who smiled at everything and yielded to nothing. She hosted every family holiday. She called David every single day without exception. She had opinions about his career, his finances, his friendships, his schedule, and eventually his marriage, and those opinions were not offered as suggestions. They were offered as conclusions that had already been reached and merely needed to be implemented. David's siblings, he had 2 brothers and a sister, had all, at various points in their adult lives, created distance from Margaret. There were years-long silences, unreturned phone calls, holidays declined. David noticed this. He attributed it entirely to his siblings being difficult. It never once occurred to him to look for the common denominator. Claire met Margaret for the first time in the fall of the year. She and David began dating. She described the meeting, years later, as like walking into a room where all the furniture has been arranged to make you feel slightly too tall for the ceiling. Margaret was gracious. Margaret was warm. Margaret asked Claire about her studies with genuine-seeming interest and told David afterward that Claire seemed nice enough. Those 2 words, nice enough, would, in retrospect, be the most honest thing Margaret ever said about the situation. Claire was nice enough to be tolerated. She was never, in Margaret's estimation, going to be enough on her own terms. Claire and David married in June of 1999. She was 23. He was 26. The wedding was held in Harlan, at the church where Claire's family had worshipped for 3 generations. Margaret spent the 2 weeks before the wedding calling David every other day with logistical concerns, seating arrangement opinions, and at least one serious suggestion that the venue be changed to accommodate the Calloway family's guest list more comfortably. David relayed each call to Claire as a kind of shared amusement. "It's just Mom," he would say. "She means well. You know how she is." And Claire, who was 23 and in love and not yet able to see the architecture underneath the warmth, said yes. "Yes, I know. Yes, it's fine. Yes, we can accommodate them. Yes." That yes, repeated in hundreds of variations over the next 22 years, was the first brick in a wall that Claire would not fully understand until she was standing on the other side of it. The version of Claire that existed in the early years of the marriage, the Claire who still talked about finishing her MBA, who brought her business textbooks to the kitchen table and read them in the evening, who had a folder on her computer labeled 5-year plan, that she updated every January, that Claire began to disappear slowly, the way daylight disappears in November. Not all at once. Not with a dramatic announcement. Just gradually, incrementally, one adjustment at a time, until one day you realize you cannot remember the last time you saw the sun. The first major concession came in 2001, when David was offered a promotion that required relocation to Columbus, Ohio. Claire had been working for 2 years at a small marketing firm in Indianapolis and had just been offered a junior management position. She turned it down. They moved to Columbus. David's career grew. Claire found part-time consulting work and told herself it was temporary. It was not temporary. In 2003, their first child, Ethan, was born. In 2005, their daughter Lily arrived. In 2008, their youngest, Noah, came into a house that was already, by then, running almost entirely on Claire's organizational labor. The school runs, the medical appointments, the birthday parties, the teacher conferences, the summer camp research, the allergy management, the emotional regulation of 3 human beings in various stages of childhood. All of it lived inside Claire's head and on Claire's calendar and in Claire's hands. David worked. David provided. David was, by the standards of his generation and his family and his social world, a good husband. He did not drink. He did not disappear on weekends. He came to the school plays. He mowed the lawn without being asked. He told Claire he loved her on her birthday and on their anniversary and sometimes, in the early years, for no reason at all. By the standards of what he had been taught love looked like, he was doing everything right. And that, as it turns out, was precisely the problem. Because everything right had been defined for David by a family system that had never once included the question, what does Claire need? What does Claire want? What is Claire giving up so that this version of everything right can exist? Margaret's involvement in their lives deepened as the children grew. It began reasonably. A grandmother wanting to see her grandchildren is not, on its face, a troubling thing. But the shape of that involvement was, over time, revelatory. Margaret did not call to ask when a good time to visit might be. She announced visits. She did not offer to help with holiday planning. She arrived with her own plans already made and presented them as gifts. She had opinions about how the children were being raised, their school choices, their extracurricular activities, the food in the refrigerator, the decor of the house, and those opinions had a way of reaching David privately, in phone calls Claire was not part of, and then arriving in the kitchen as David's own thoughts. "I've been thinking," he would say. And Claire learned, over years, to recognize the particular flatness in his voice that meant he had not been thinking. He had been told. There was one incident, in the winter of 2014, that Claire would later identify as the moment she understood, clearly and completely, the true nature of what she was living inside. Noah was 6 years old. He had been enrolled in a local elementary school that Claire had researched carefully, a school with a strong academic record, and a particularly good program for children who, like Noah, were quietly observant and needed a slower-paced social environment to thrive. Claire had toured the school twice. She had met the principal. She had read the curriculum documents. She had made this decision with the same deliberate, careful attention she brought to every decision about her children. And then Margaret visited for Christmas, spent 3 days speaking privately with David about how the school in the better neighborhood across town had a superior reputation. And in January, David told Claire they should look at transferring Noah. Claire asked why. David said he had been doing some research. Claire said, specifically, what research? And David could not answer, because there was no research. There was only Margaret. Claire did not make a scene. She did not call Margaret and confront her. She filed it away. That is what years of living in a system of quiet control teach you, not to erupt, because eruption is always used as evidence against you, but to observe and to file and to wait. She had no idea in 2014 that she was already unconsciously, instinctively beginning to build a case. She thought she was just surviving. She did not yet know the difference. By 2018, the marriage had settled into a kind of functional coldness. David and Claire were not cruel to each other. They did not fight in the dramatic, operatic way of people on television. They orbited. They managed the household together with the efficiency of two people who have learned to coordinate without connecting. The intimacy had receded so gradually that neither of them could have identified the moment it left. They ate dinner together. They attended the children's events together. They went to David's family's Thanksgiving together, where Claire spent 4 hours in Margaret's kitchen, helping prepare a meal that Margaret would receive all the credit for, while Margaret asked David's brothers about their careers and their plans and their opinions, and addressed Claire only when there was a task to be assigned. Claire told her closest friend, a woman named Sandra who had known her since their children were in preschool together, that she sometimes felt like a piece of furniture in her own marriage. A useful piece, a well-maintained piece, but furniture nonetheless. And then came the spring of 2021, and everything that had been building for 22 years finally found its trigger. Margaret turned 70 that April, and she decided, without a word of consultation with the woman whose home she was planning to use, that the celebration would be a full weekend gathering at David and Claire's house. 33 family members, 2 nights, catered Saturday evening, home-cooked Sunday brunch. The invitations went out through a family group chat on a Thursday afternoon. Claire found out on Thursday evening, reading through her phone after putting Noah to bed. She sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time before she went back downstairs. She found David in the living room. She was calm. She had practiced being calm for so long that it was no longer a practice. It was simply how she existed. She told him she had seen the group chat. She told him that she would need him to speak with his mother, that decisions about their home needed to involve her, that this was a basic matter of respect. David set down his phone. He looked at her. And he said something he had said in various forms for 22 years, something that had become so familiar it had lost the power to wound her in any ordinary way. But that night, in the context of 33 uninvited guests and a group chat she'd been included in only so she would know about the plans she hadn't made. "Don't make this a big deal, Claire. It's my mother's 70th birthday. You're always doing this." And then he left the room. Always doing this. In 22 years, the this was never defined. It was a floating accusation, a fog that settled over any complaint Claire raised, making the complaint itself the problem rather than whatever had prompted it. She was always doing this. She was too sensitive. She was too difficult. She made things harder than they needed to be. And because she had heard it so many times, because it had been backed up and reinforced by a family system that had a shared investment in that narrative, she had spent years half believing it. Maybe she was too difficult. Maybe she expected too much. Maybe the version of marriage she had imagined for herself at 21, reading business textbooks at Indiana University, was simply incompatible with the version that real life offered. That night after David went to bed, Claire sat at the kitchen table until 2 o'clock in the morning. She did not cry. She was past that. She opened a folder on her laptop, not the one labeled 5-year plan, which had not been updated in years. A different folder, one she had been quietly adding to for 37 months, and she looked at what she had assembled. And then she picked up her phone and sent a text message to a number she had been carrying in her contacts for 2 years without using. The message said, "I think I'm ready. Can we talk this week?" The person she texted was a family attorney named Rebecca Moore, who had been a colleague of Claire's sister-in-law and who specialized in a particular area of family law that Claire had spent 3 years quietly educating herself about: the legal framework around coercive control in long-term marriages. Claire had not come to that kitchen table unprepared. She had come to it ready. The week after Claire sent that text message, she met Rebecca Moore for the first time in person at a coffee shop in Dublin, Ohio, 12 miles from the house she shared with David. She brought a folder. Rebecca Moore would later say that in 15 years of family law practice, she had never had an initial consultation in which a client arrived with documentation that well organized. 3 years of notes, time-stamped, dated, specific, not emotional recollections, not "he always made me feel small," though there was that too, but a documented record of incidents, decisions, patterns, the vacation plans made without her, the financial arrangements with Margaret she had discovered only accidentally, the school meeting David had attended without telling her, the 3 occasions on which Margaret had called one of the children directly to countermand something Claire had already told them, the pattern of David presenting Margaret's opinions as his own, the way that Claire's objections to these things had consistently been reframed, within the family narrative, as Claire's personality problem rather than as legitimate concerns. Rebecca Moore read through the folder in that coffee shop and then looked up at Claire and said, "How long have you been building this?" Claire said, "I didn't know I was building anything. I thought I was just keeping notes so I wouldn't feel crazy." Rebecca said, "You weren't going crazy. You were documenting a pattern. And what's in this folder, combined with some additional financial discovery, has the potential to reframe your entire legal position." What Rebecca was referring to was something Claire had stumbled onto 18 months earlier. She had been reviewing the household finances, something she did quarterly, carefully, because she had learned early in the marriage that staying informed about money was a form of self-protection, and she had found a series of transactions that she could not initially account for. Regular transfers from the joint savings account, not large enough individually to trigger alarm, regular enough to constitute a pattern. She had spent 6 months working with a forensic accountant named Patricia Daniels, who agreed to work on retainer to trace those transfers. What they found was not theft in any straightforward sense. It was, rather, a system, long-standing, deliberate, structured of financial decisions that had been made jointly between David and Margaret over years without Claire's knowledge or input. Investments held in accounts she had no access to. a property decision made in Margaret's name using funds that had technically originated in the joint account. The accountant used a specific phrase in her notes. Financial arrangement consistent with documented patterns of economic control in long-term coercive relationships. Claire kept working on those notes. She kept meeting with Rebecca. She kept going to the school runs and the teacher conferences and making dinner and attending David's family's events with the same quiet composure she had always maintained. Nobody noticed, because nobody was looking. Why would they? Claire was always there. Claire was always fine. Claire was always managing. That was the thing about being the invisible person in a family system. Your invisibility becomes your greatest strategic advantage the moment you decide to use it. And then came the Sunday afternoon in March when David sat down across from Claire at the kitchen table. His posture was different that day. His voice had a quality she recognized, the quality of words that had been rehearsed, possibly with an audience of one. Later, she would almost be certain that he and Margaret had spoken the night before. The phrasing was too clean, too structured, too unlike the way David normally expressed himself when he was actually expressing himself. He said, "My family feels disrespected by you. My mother is upset. My brother's wives have said things. My sister hasn't wanted to come to the house since Christmas. And I need you to understand they were here before you. They will be here after. So I need you to decide. Are you going to be part of this family on their terms, or are you going to keep choosing your pride over your marriage?" 22 years, 3 children, a paused career, a relocated life, a decade and a half of holidays in Margaret's kitchen and family group chats she was included in only functionally and financial decisions she had not been part of, and the very real, very documented, very specific erasure of herself that she had been quietly recording for 37 months. And he had just summarized all of it as pride. He had looked at her survival as ego. She looked at him for 3 seconds. She said, "I'll let you know what I decide." He left the room feeling like he had made his position clear. She remained at the table and did not move for a very long time. And then, with a steadiness that she would later describe as the strangest thing she had ever felt, not anger, not grief, but a peculiar, absolute clarity, the kind that only arrives when you have run out of the energy required to pretend, she picked up her phone and called Rebecca Moore and said, "I've made my decision. Let's begin." In the 2 days that followed, David interpreted Claire's silence as compliance. He had seen this before. Claire would get upset, Claire would go quiet, and then Claire would adjust. That was the pattern. That was what always happened. He told his mother on the phone Monday evening that he thought he had gotten through to her. Margaret said good. She said she had always believed Claire was reasonable when properly approached. She said she was looking forward to a better dynamic going forward. Neither of them noticed that Claire had spent Monday and Tuesday organizing her paperwork into 2 envelopes, meeting with Rebecca Moore by phone for 90 minutes, and having a specific, detailed conversation with the forensic accountant about which documents would be most relevant to formal proceedings. On Friday morning, when David came downstairs for breakfast, Claire was already dressed, not in her usual clothes. She was composed, neat, specific, deliberate in the way that people who have made irreversible decisions often are. There were 2 envelopes on the kitchen table. She told him to open them. The first contained a formal letter from Rebecca Moore, outlining Claire's intention to file for divorce and requesting mediation. The second contained a 14-page document that Claire had written herself, not a legal document, but a personal record of their marriage, specifically the last 8 years, dated incidents, named patterns, his responses and his silences documented with a specificity that made it impossible to dismiss as impression or emotion. It was a record, it was accurate, and it was devastating. David's first phone call after Claire had walked out of the kitchen was to his mother. Margaret listened, and then she said 3 words that would become, in the months ahead, the most consequential mistake she made in the entire chain of consequential mistakes. She said, "She is bluffing." She was not bluffing. And Margaret's certainty that she was, her absolute, unquestioned confidence in a narrative she had authored and controlled for 22 years, was the thing that prevented David from doing the only thing that might have changed the outcome. Taking Claire seriously immediately, listening without defending, and finding his way, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, to a genuine reckoning. Instead, guided by that confidence, he called his attorney and began the process of preparing to contest what he believed was an emotional performance. He did not call Claire. He did not go looking for her in the house. He did not sit with the 14-page document and read it with the attention it deserved. He filed it away. He told himself she was emotional. He told himself this was Claire always doing this, on a larger scale than usual. He told himself Margaret was right. She had always been right about things like this. David's attorney was a competent man named Robert Haynes, who had handled family law matters in Columbus for 2 decades. He reviewed what David brought him and proceeded accordingly. What he did not fully appreciate, initially, was the quality of the documentation on the other side. When he finally received the formal disclosure from Rebecca Moore, the 37 months of records, the forensic accountant's findings, the documented pattern of financial decisions made without Claire's knowledge, he reportedly sat with it for a long time before calling David. He said, "This is not a bluff. This is a case." The mediation process began 6 weeks later. In those 6 weeks, something else was unfolding that neither David nor Margaret had anticipated. Claire had done something neither of them had ever credited her with the capacity to do. She had been honest with her children, not in a manipulative way, not with the intent to put them in the middle. She had sat down, separately, with Ethan, who was then 20, with Lily, who was 18, and with Noah, who was 15, and she had told them, in language appropriate to each of them, what was happening and why. And she had told them that she would never ask them to choose sides, but that they were old enough to have their own understanding of what their family had been, and she would not lie to them about that. She told them she loved them. She told them she was going to be fine, and she asked them to take care of themselves first, whatever happened. What she did not know, what she would find out only at the mediation, was that all 3 of her children had something they wanted to say. Mediation in family law is, by its nature, a process designed to be less dramatic than a courtroom. It takes place in conference rooms. It involves spreadsheets and property valuations and parenting schedules. It is, in most cases, precisely as unglamorous as it sounds. The mediation between Claire and David Calloway began on a Thursday morning in May at the offices of a firm in downtown Columbus, and by the accounts of people close to the proceedings, it was everything a mediation is designed to be: orderly, structured, careful, right up until the moment it stopped being any of those things. The first session went as these things typically go. Attorneys presented positions. Documents were reviewed. Claire was calm throughout. David was, by his own later admission to a friend, unsettled by how calm she was. He had expected, on some level, the version of Claire he had been dealing with for 22 years. The Claire who adjusted, who accommodated, who softened at the right moment. This Claire was different. This Claire had made her calculations. And she was simply waiting for the process to arrive at the conclusions she had already reached. What changed everything was not anything that happened inside the conference room. It was something that happened outside of it. During a mid-morning recess on the second day of mediation, David stepped out to make a phone call. He did not call Robert Haynes. He called Margaret. And Margaret, who had been sitting at home for 2 days certain that her assessment of the situation was correct, who had not wavered in her belief that Claire was running a performance designed to extract concessions and would ultimately stand down, told David to hold firm. She told him Claire needed him more than she was letting on. She told him the children would come around. David, who had been listening to this voice as the voice of reason his entire life, took a breath and went back inside. What happened next was not something David or Margaret had been able to account for, because it came from a direction neither of them had thought to look. Rebecca Moore placed a document on the conference table. It was the forensic accountant's report, Patricia Daniels' full findings, formatted for legal proceedings. The room went quiet as Robert Haynes read through it. And then Rebecca Moore placed a second document beside it, a market rate valuation, prepared by an independent consultant, of the labor Claire had contributed to the household over 22 years. Childcare, household management, medical coordination, educational planning and execution, emotional support and family administration. Each category itemized. Each given a market rate dollar figure based on the going professional rates for equivalent services in Columbus, Ohio. The number at the bottom of that document was substantial. It was not an emotional argument. It was an economic one. And in a room full of attorneys, economic arguments have a particular weight. Robert Haynes asked for a recess. David stepped outside again. He called Margaret again. And whatever she said in that phone call, David has never disclosed it in full. The result was that when he came back to the table, rather than moving toward resolution, the posture shifted toward the only tools left when rational arguments have run out: pressure, and the people most vulnerable to it. That evening, Margaret called Ethan. He was 20 years old in his second year of college. She told him that his mother was destroying the family. She told him that if the children expressed to the mediator that they wanted their parents to stay together, it might change the direction of things. She told him that this was what families did, they protected themselves. Ethan listened. He said very little. He thanked her for calling, and then he called his mother. Claire answered on the second ring. She could hear in his voice before he said a word that something had happened. He told her what Margaret had said. He told her every word of it as precisely as he could remember. And then he said, "Mom, what do you need us to do?" And Claire said, "I need you to tell the truth. Whatever you see as the truth, that's all." All three children submitted written statements to the mediator. Ethan was 20. Lily was 18. Noah was 15, and his statement was submitted through a separate, age-appropriate process. The mediator was a woman named Dr. Susan Park, a licensed family therapist with 15 years of experience in high-conflict divorce mediation, and she has spoken publicly, in general terms, about the kind of case this represents, without identifying the parties. Ethan wrote about watching his mother sit in silence at family dinners, about the specific, recurring experience of watching his father look to his grandmother before he looked to his wife, about the year he was 12 and his mother had applied for a part-time position at a marketing firm, and his father had come home one evening and told her the timing wasn't right, and Ethan had overheard the phone call with his grandmother that preceded that conversation by 4 hours. He wrote about learning what he did not want his own marriage to look like by watching what happened in his parents' kitchen. Lily wrote about money, about a summer when she was 14 when she had overheard a conversation between her father and her grandmother about a property investment, and her mother's name had never come up. About asking her mother once, when she was 16, whether she was happy, and watching her mother smile in the specific way she had, the smile that went to the mouth and stopped there, and say, "I'm fine, sweetheart." About knowing, even at 16, that fine was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. Noah wrote one paragraph. It said, "My mom is the person who taught me that being kind matters more than being right, and that patience is something you earn by practicing it every day. I watched her practice it for my whole life. I don't think she got enough back." Dr. Susan Park brought David into a private session the following afternoon. She asked him one question. In subsequent interviews, she has paraphrased it this way: "Outside of what your family has expected of you, and I mean your family of origin, not your children, what do you personally believe your children learned about love from watching your marriage?" David sat with this question for a long time. There was, by the accounts of those who knew him during this period, something cracking in him. Not breaking, necessarily, cracking, the specific sound of a worldview that has never been seriously questioned, meeting the moment when it can no longer avoid examination. He said, "I think they learned that their mother would do anything for the people she loved, and I think they learned that it wasn't always enough." He paused, and then he said, "I wanted them to have seen her treated better than she was." It was, by multiple accounts, the most honest thing David Calloway had said about his marriage in 20 years. The settlement was reached outside of court. It was, by legal standards, equitable, a fair division of the marital assets, a support arrangement that the forensic accountant's findings materially strengthened, a co-parenting structure that Rebecca Moore had designed carefully around the children's ages and stages. Robert Haynes, to his credit, had pivoted when the weight of the evidence made it clear that the only sensible path forward was one that acknowledged reality rather than continued to contest it. The settlement took 11 weeks from the first mediation session to the final signing. In family law terms, that is considered efficient. In human terms, it was 11 weeks that would reconfigure the lives of 5 people. The detail that spread. The detail that made its way into online forums and relationship discussion groups and comment sections, and at least 3 separate Reddit threads over the months that followed, that generated the arguments that are still happening in some corners of the internet. The detail that people debated and quoted and held up as either the most powerful thing they had ever heard or a piece of emotional theater, depending on who was telling the story. That detail had nothing to do with money. Claire had asked for something that was not on any standard settlement template. She had asked for it quietly, through Rebecca Moore, in the final week of negotiations, and she had made clear that it was important to her in a way that other things were not. She had asked David to sign a written acknowledgement, not a legal finding, not a court order. A personal document, prepared specifically for this purpose, in which David recognized by name, in his own words, with his own signature, Claire's contribution to the family over 22 years. Her professional sacrifices, her labor, her presence, her role in building the lives that their children were now living, not as a concession in litigation, not as a legal obligation, but as a truth that had never been spoken clearly in the 22 years during which it was occurring, and that she wanted documented now, finally, in a form that could not be revised or reframed or quietly reassigned to someone else's credit. David's attorney advised against it. He said it was unusual. He said it created a record he wasn't comfortable with. He said there was no legal precedent requiring it and that David was under no obligation to agree to it. David thought about it for 2 days, and then he signed it. He did not tell Margaret he had signed it. He did not tell his brothers. He made that decision alone, in a way that was, for a man who had made almost no significant decisions alone in his adult life, its own kind of milestone. Claire did not frame it. She did not photograph it for social media. She did not show it to her friends or bring it up in conversations as a victory. She folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope and mailed it to Ethan's college apartment with a handwritten note. The note said 4 words. "You were worth it." Ethan called her when he received it. She said he cried. She did too, finally. The first time, she told Sandra afterward that she had cried in a very long time. 18 months after that Sunday afternoon in the Columbus kitchen, Claire Calloway, she had kept the last name for the children, and because she had earned it as much as anyone, was enrolled in an online MBA program through Ohio State, part-time, structured around her parenting weeks. She had also taken on consulting work, using the business skills she had maintained through quiet, private reading across 2 decades of being told, implicitly and sometimes explicitly, that her professional ambitions were an inconvenience to the family's real priorities. Her youngest, Noah, who was by now 16, told her one evening that she seemed different. She asked him how. He thought about it and said, "Like you can breathe more." She told him she thought that was exactly right. David, for his part, went through something that his closer friends described, in the careful, measured language of people who like a man, and are still reckoning with what he participated in, as a significant personal reckoning. He began therapy in the fall after the settlement, for the first time in his life. He began, slowly and imperfectly, the process of building a relationship with his mother that did not require him to be 17 years old in her presence. He scaled back the daily calls. He declined, for the first time in his adult memory, to attend a family event that conflicted with something his children had asked him to be present for. These were not dramatic gestures. They were quiet, uncomfortable, incremental rearrangements of a life that had been organized around someone else's gravity for 46 years. He was not a villain who reformed. He was something more common and, in some ways, more difficult to write about. A man who had been shaped so thoroughly by a system he had never questioned that recognizing its effects on the people around him required dismantling a significant portion of the story he had been told about himself. He and Claire sat next to each other at Noah's school's spring concert 7 months after the divorce was finalized. They did not speak much. They applauded at the same moments. They smiled at the same moments. When it was over, David told Claire that Noah had gotten very good. Claire said she knew. They walked to their separate cars. It was, by any external measure, an unremarkable evening. It was also, in the long context of everything that had preceded it, a kind of peace that neither of them had been certain was available to them. I hope you enjoyed this story. I will leave you with this today. Here is the thing about coercive control, the thing that makes it so difficult to name and so difficult to leave. It is almost never one dramatic moment. It is the accumulation of 1,000 small moments, each of which, in isolation, can be explained away, minimized, attributed to stress or miscommunication or the ordinary friction of a long marriage. It is the slow, patient architecture of someone being made smaller. And the cruelest part of that process is that, after enough time, the person being made smaller begins to assist in the construction, begins to anticipate the adjustments required, begins to call their own disappearance accommodation and to call their own boundaries ego. Claire called it pride for 22 years. It was not pride, it was personhood, and she had to nearly lose it entirely to understand the difference. We are not telling you this story to make you afraid of marriage, or afraid of in-laws, or afraid of love. We are telling you this story because the patterns in it are real, and they are common, and they happen in houses in every town in this country, and they happen so quietly that the people inside them often cannot see them clearly until they have been living in them for a very long time. We are telling you this story because Claire's decision, that decision was not made in a moment of anger. It was made in a moment of clarity, and there is a profound difference between those two things. We want to know what you think. Drop your thoughts in the comments right now. At what point in this story did you see the red flags most clearly? Was David a man who chose to harm his wife, or a man who had never been taught to see her? What do you think of the clause Claire asked for in the settlement, the written acknowledgement? Was that the right move, or was it unnecessary? And we want to know this most of all. If you were in Claire's position, what would you have done differently, and at what point? These are not rhetorical questions. We genuinely want to hear from you. The conversation in the comments on stories like this one is always more valuable than the story itself, because it is real people recognizing real things from their own lives, and there is nothing more important than that. And before we go today, if this story moved something in you, if it made you see something you hadn't quite been able to name before, if it reminded you of someone you know, or something you have lived through yourself, then please share this video. Not for us, for the person in your life who needs to hear it. Because sometimes the difference between seeing clearly and not seeing at all is simply one story, told the right way, at the right moment. If you have not subscribed to this channel yet, please do it right now. Hit the bell so you get notified the moment we post. And if you are new here, welcome. This is Scars and Stories. We tell captivating stories that you will love. See you next time.